My grandmother's cabin was my inheritance, a quiet little retreat tucked away deep in the woods. When she was alive, she had one very strange rule: never, ever leave the basement door open overnight. I always just thought it was an old wives' tale, a quirky superstition. So, on my first night alone in the cabin, I did something I would regret for the rest of my life. I left the door open. And when I woke up, I wasn't alone anymore. There are some things you expect to inherit. My grandmother's fine china, maybe her collection of dusty first edition books. I never expected to inherit a place so deeply tied to her that just breathing the air inside felt like talking to her again. The cabin wasn't grand. It was just this humble two-story place made of dark, old pine that had settled into the landscape so perfectly it looked less like it was built and more like it had just grown there. It was at the end of a long, winding dirt road, miles from anyone, hugged on all sides by a thick, silent forest. For me, it had always been a sanctuary. I spent my summer vacations on its wide, creaking porch, just listening to the crickets and the sound of the wind through the leaves. My grandmother, Eleanor, was a woman carved from the same sturdy, resilient stuff as the cabin itself. She was kind, with a laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes. But she had this serious side, too, a deep respect for the old ways, for the stories and warnings passed down through generations. I remember her telling me tales about the woods, about the things that walked in the deep dark when the moon was hiding. I'd listen, wide-eyed and thrilled, but I always filed them away as folklore, campfire stories. They were part of her charm, part of the cabin's whole mystique. When she passed away, the grief was this heavy cloak. But inheriting the cabin felt like she'd left a piece of herself behind for me to hold on to. The lawyer handed me a set of old iron keys, the deed was signed, and just like that, the place was mine. Going back for the first time alone was strange. The silence was different without her puttering around the kitchen or the soft sound of her radio in the living room. It was a deeper silence, one that seemed to push in from the woods outside. I spent that first day unpacking my bags and my memories. Every faded photo on the wall, every chipped mug in the cupboard. It was all a ghost of a past happiness. It felt safe. It felt like home. But there was one memory that always lingered at the edge of my mind, this peculiar little ritual she had. Every single night, without fail, she would walk down the narrow upstairs hallway to a heavy oak door at the very end. She'd check the simple latch, give the door a firm tug to make sure it was secure, and then she'd turn to me. The seriousness in her eyes was so different from her usual warmth. "The basement," she'd say, her voice low. "You let the day in, but you keep the night out. Never, ever leave this door open overnight." Of course, I asked why. So many times. Her answers were always vague, mixed with the same folklore she'd tell me on the porch. She'd talk about drafts, about animals, about the night air carrying sickness. But sometimes, her gaze would get distant and shadowed, and she'd whisper, "Some things are best left undisturbed. Some doors are meant to stay closed." I loved her for it. I loved her quirks and superstitions. I just saw it as a beautiful, harmless eccentricity. In my modern, rational mind, there was an explanation for everything. A creak was the house settling. A shadow was a trick of the light. A warning was just a story. And that belief, that confident, naive dismissal of the unknown, that would be my undoing. The first night after the funeral, when all the arrangements were done, and the silence of my own apartment became too loud, I drove out to the cabin. I needed the quiet. I needed to feel close to her. The woods welcomed me back, and for a few hours, I actually felt at peace. But there are some routines that just feel wrong to break, aren't there? Have you ever left a door open overnight and woken up to something different? It's a simple question, But for me, the answer is a story that completely rewrote my definition of fear. A story that began with the simple, foolish act of ignoring a dead woman's last warning. That first day bled quietly into evening. I made a simple dinner in her kitchen, a familiar layout a comfort to my grieving heart. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the worn furniture, tracing the paths her own hands had taken 1,000 times. The isolation, which had once felt like a cozy blanket, now had a sharp edge. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was dead silent. No birds, no distant cars, just an unnerving stillness that felt like it was listening as dusk began to stain the sky orange and purple. A heavy, humid heat settled over the cabin. The air got thick, stagnant. I opened a few windows, hoping for a breeze, but it was just as still and oppressive outside. And that's when I remembered the basement door. Grandma would sometimes prop it open during the day in the summer. It led down to a musty, stone-walled cellar, and she claimed it helped circulate the cool, damp air through the old house, a kind of natural air conditioning. And it worked. You could feel this subtle, cool current drifting up from the dark. I walked to the end of the upstairs hall. The door stood there, imposing and silent. It was made of thick, dark oak with black iron hinges and a simple, heavy latch. It looked ancient. I hesitated for a second, her voice echoing in my mind. Never, ever leave this door open overnight. I almost listened. I swear, I almost did. I even rested my hand on the cool wood, ready to pull it shut. But then, a wave of heat washed over me, and my modern, rational brain took over. Asterisk, it's just a superstition. It's hot. I'm an adult. A little airflow will help me sleep. Asterisk, it was a tiny act of rebellion, I guess. A little statement that this was my cabin now, and I wasn't bound by old folktales. I found the small wooden wedge she used and propped the door open, leaving a gap of about a foot. A draft of cool, earthy-smelling air immediately sighed up from the darkness below. It was a relief. I smiled to myself, a little smug, and went to get ready for bed. The bedroom was at the other end of the hall. It was cozy, with a large window that looked out into the pitch-black woods. I lay down in her bed, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. The house started making its usual nighttime sounds, the groan of aging wood, the soft tick of the grandfather clock downstairs. These were the sounds of my childhood, the lullabies that had always sung me to sleep. But tonight, they sounded different, sharper. Each creak seemed to have an intention behind it. The wind, when it finally picked up, didn't whisper. It hissed. I told myself it was just grief, solitude, my imagination running wild. I was on edge, and every sound was amplified. I closed my eyes, focused on the gentle, cool air drifting from the hallway, and eventually, I slipped into a restless sleep. I think it was around 2 in the morning when the first sound pulled me awake. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching. At first, my sleepy brain just dismissed it. A branch against the house. A mouse in the walls. I rolled over, trying to sink back into sleep, but the sound kept going. Asterisk scratch, scratch. Scratched out asterisk, it was slow, deliberate, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house, from the hallway. My heart started beating a little faster. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The sound stopped. The silence that rushed in was somehow worse. I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. "You're just tired," I whispered, the sound of my own voice startlingly loud. "It's an old house." I lay back down, but sleep was a lost cause now. Every nerve was on fire. My eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. The moon had risen, casting long, twisted shadows through the window. The branches of the old oak tree outside looked like bony fingers clawing at the glass. And then I saw it. A shadow in the corner of my room, near the doorway, moved. It wasn't a flicker from the leaves outside. It was a slow, deliberate stretching, as if something tall and thin was uncoiling in the dark. My blood ran cold. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched, my eyes locked on that corner. The shadow seemed to gather itself, becoming a patch of darkness that was somehow blacker than the rest of the room. And just as quickly as it had formed, it dissolved. I might have screamed, but the sound was trapped in my throat, a tight knot of pure terror. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. I switched on the flashlight, the bright beam cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. I swept it across the room, into the corner where I'd seen the movement. Nothing was there. Just a floral armchair and a stack of my grandmother's books. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I felt dizzy. Was I losing my mind? A waking nightmare brought on by stress and grief? It had to be. That was the only logical explanation. My legs trembling. I forced myself out of bed. I needed to prove it was nothing. I stepped into the hallway, my phone's light leading the way. The cool draft was still flowing up from the open basement door at the far end. Everything was quiet, still. As I got closer to the basement door, though, I smelled something. It was faint, but unmistakable. A coppery metallic tang, like old pennies or blood. It seemed to be coming from the dark opening. I stood there, peering down into the stairwell, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path into the gloom. The stone steps descended into nothing, empty. I backed away slowly, my logical mind failing me. Every instinct was screaming that I was in danger. I retreated to my bedroom, my back against the wall, and I didn't just close my bedroom door. I slammed it shut, and in a fit of pure panic, I shoved the heavy floral armchair against it. A barricade. I climbed back into bed, shaking uncontrollably. I knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that I was not alone in the house. The barricade felt pathetic. A child's defense against a monster, but it was all I had. The night deepened, and the silence was gone. Now there was a floorboard creaking in the hall, just outside my door. Not the random settling of an old house, but the slow, measured creak of a heavy footstep. Then another, and another. Something was pacing in the hallway. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just a faint murmur, like a distant radio. But the sound grew clearer. It wasn't one voice. It was many, overlapping, a mess of hushed, angry muttering. And within that chorus, one voice started to stand out. It was familiar. It was the voice of my grandmother's brother, Arthur, a man who had died long before I was ever born. The whispers twisted his name, repeating it like a curse. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears, but the sounds were inside my head now. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. The whispering ceased. An absolute, profound silence fell over the house. A waiting silence. I held my breath, listening for the handle to turn, for the armchair to scrape against the floor. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, taut and terrible. And then a new sound began. The scratching. But this was frantic, desperate clawing. Not at my bedroom door. From downstairs? From the basement. It was the sound of something trying to get out. Sleep was a joke. I sat huddled in that bed, blankets pulled up to my chin, my eyes glued to the barricaded door. The hours crawled by. The frantic scratching from the basement would continue, then stop for long, terrifying stretches, only to start again with a renewed, vicious intensity. It sounded like a caged animal, furious and desperate. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to soften the absolute blackness. A tiny, rational part of my brain screamed, that light would save me. Monsters belonged to the dark. The sun would make them disappear, as scratching hit a peak right as the sun was rising. A final, frenzied burst of splintering wood and scraping stone. And then it stopped. The total silence was more deafening than the noise had been. The house was utterly still. I stayed in that bed for what felt like an eternity, just listening. My fear had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. I knew I couldn't stay in that room forever. It was either face what was in the house or let it keep me prisoner. Slowly, shakily, I got out of bed. My muscles ached. I moved the armchair, the sound of its legs scraping on the floor an obscene noise in the silence. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a thick glass paperweight from the nightstand. It felt laughably small. I opened the bedroom door and peered into the hallway. It was empty. The gray morning light filtered in, casting everything in a flat, lifeless glow. And at the far end of the hall, the basement door, the one I had only propped ajar, now stood wide open. A gaping black mouth in the wall. Every step down that hallway was a battle. The air grew colder as I got closer, and that metallic smell of blood was stronger now, thick in the back of my throat. I stood at the threshold, the paperweight clutched in my white-knuckled hand, and peered down. "Hello?" My voice was a weak, trembling thing. The only answer was a low growl that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, vibrating through the solace of my feet. It wasn't the growl of any animal I'd ever heard. But my hand was shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone. I turned on the flashlight, aiming it down the stairs. The beam landed on the damp stone wall. Then it moved lower, catching the bottom step. And then it found him. It was crouched there, folded into the shadows. At first, it looked like a man, but the proportions were all wrong. Horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, stretched and thin like a spider's legs, bent at impossible angles. It was a silhouette, a figure carved from the darkness, so deep it seemed to absorb the light. I couldn't really see a face, but I could see its eyes. They weren't human. They were 2 points of malevolent yellow light that burned with a cold fire. They fixed on me instantly. Time stopped. My breath caught in my chest. The figure unfolded itself, rising slowly, impossibly, to its full height. It was tall, so tall its head nearly brushed the low basement ceiling. Its stretched-out form seemed to move with a nightmarish grace. It took a step onto the bottom stair. The wood groaned under a weight that seemed far greater than its slender form suggested. And then it spoke. Its voice was a rasping, graveyard dry sound. It was the voice I'd heard in the whispers. My great-uncle Arthur's voice. It whispered my name. My mind just shattered. This was the thing my grandmother had warned me about. This was why she had her ritual. This was the family secret she had kept locked behind a simple wooden door. This was the curse. The figure lunged. It didn't run. It flowed up the stairs, a river of shadow and malice, its yellow eyes never leaving mine. I saw a long 3-fingered hand reach for me, its claws like black, broken glass. I finally found my scream. It was a raw, primal sound. I stumbled backward, turned, and fled. I scrambled, my feet slipping on the floorboards. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear the dry rasp of its breathing right behind me. I threw my whole body against the front door, fumbling for the handle. I swung it shut. Just as the heavy oak slammed into the frame, its clawed hand shot through the closing gap. I saw the black, glistening talons for a split second before I slammed the door fully closed. There was a sickening scrape of claws on wood and a high-pitched shriek of rage from the other side. I didn't wait. I fumbled the latch home, but I knew it wasn't enough. I ran downstairs, grabbed a hammer and a handful of long, thick nails from my grandfather's old toolbox. and ran back upstairs. As I hammered the first nail into the door and the frame, the thing on the other side began to beat against the wood. The entire wall shook. It shrieked and howled. With every nail I hammered in, sealing it in its prison, its fury seemed to grow. I didn't stop until I had used every single nail, reinforcing the door until it was a tomb. And then I just collapsed against the opposite wall, a hammer falling from my hand, and listened as the howls of my family's curse slowly faded back into silence. The sun was high in the sky when I finally moved. The air in the house was still and heavy, pregnant with a terrible knowledge. The peace of the cabin was gone forever, replaced by the chilling awareness of what was sleeping and waiting just a few feet away. Later that day, I started searching the house, desperate to understand. In the back of my grandmother's closet, in an old hat box, I found her diary. Most of it was what you'd expect: notes about the weather, recipes, memories. But near the back, the entries changed. The writing became frantic, jagged. She wrote about her brother, Arthur. He had been a cruel, violent man. One night, during a terrible storm, he had come to the cabin in a drunken rage. She wrote that she was terrified for her life. She lured him into the basement, and in a moment of desperate self-preservation, locked him in. The storm washed out the only road. By the time anyone could get to the cabin days later, Arthur was gone. They said he had starved. The last entry was written in a shaky, tear-stained hand. I did not let him out. God forgive me. I did not let him out. But he did not leave. He is still here, in the dark. He waits. The door must stay closed. The curse is mine to bear. It wasn't just a ghost. It was a spirit of vengeance, born from an act of desperation and betrayal, fueled by years of rage in the dark. A family curse created by my own grandmother. I never spent another night in that cabin. I had the door professionally reinforced with steel and multiple deadbolts, but I couldn't sell the property. I couldn't pass that burden, that waiting darkness, onto another family. So the cabin just sits there, empty and silent, a monument to a terrible secret. Sometimes I still wonder about that thing. Was it really my great-uncle's spirit, or was it something older that had been sleeping in the earth beneath the house, that his violent death had simply awakened? I don't have the answers. I just know that some doors are meant to stay closed. I bolt and lock every door in my house at night, checking them over and over. I can never sleep in total darkness, because every time I close my eyes, I see two glowing yellow points of light, and I hear the sound of claws scraping against wood, a sound that reminds me that I left a door open. And something different woke up. Have you ever inherited something with a strange history, or a warning you were tempted to ignore? Share your own spooky stories or strange family traditions in the comments below. If this story chilled you, please consider liking and subscribing for more true terrors. Be safe, and always check your locks.